Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about The X-Files Season 2 Episode 5. It's called Duane Barry. So spoilers for the episode. I mean, first things first, I had no idea this was the first half of a two-parter. So the to be continued at the end caught me off guard. And it was funny because I was thinking, because this episode's about a hostage crisis, right? That's what most of the episode is. But it wraps up 9 minutes before the end of the episode because I checked and I went, oh, that's interesting. There's 9 minutes left. Typically I would expect the main thing would wrap up and you'd have a couple of epilogue scenes. So there's maybe only usually a couple of minutes after something like that wraps up in an episode of X-Files. But I was like, okay, let's see what we're doing here with the ending. And it was setting up more things with Scully towards the end. And I was like, how are they going to wrap this up? The ending of this is going to feel very, very rushed. And then it hit me with the to be continued, and I went, oh, okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Because that's something X-Files hasn't really pulled yet. I mean, the season finale had a kind of a cliffhanger, I guess, but as a straight up, classic two-parter where it very much is unfinished until the next episode is not something they've done yet, but it makes sense. We're in an era where that happened occasionally. As for the episode itself, it's pretty solid. I think it's an interesting take. We're getting back to aliens here. We're getting back to Mulder being in over his head and being tantalized and drawn into someone talking about being abducted by aliens because he closely cares about that. He cares about what happened to his sister. So he wants to believe every idiot who says that. And that's kind of what they play with here. Now, I'm not saying the character here is an idiot. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that that's the way Mulder kind of jumps at these things every time they come up. And they actually play with the fact, or play with the mystery, whether or not this guy is genuinely being someone who is abducted, or at least believes he's been abducted, versus he is actually just psychotic, that he is actually suffering from mental delusions. And it kind of plays with whether or not it's true or not. And it definitely starts as if it's true to the audience, I would say, based on the opening, the cold open, which has him lying in his bed in 1985, and this bright light hits, and it seems like these aliens are coming from beyond the doors and the windows. And we sort of flash back to that throughout as he's telling his story. And it does kind of link up with some of the visuals and details that we've heard from Mulder and some of the other cases that we've had. The bright lights, the losing time. But as the episode goes on, it kind of tries to throw in this swerve here where he may not actually really be someone who's abducted. He may actually just be crazy. And by the time we get to that point in the episode, Mulder's already given himself in as a hostage pretty much. He didn't necessarily go in with that intent, but he's fundamentally traded himself with a hostage, and he's now trapped with this potentially psychotic person who's got a gun, who's threatening people. It's a whole thing. So Scully's the one who looks into the guy's past and gets very concerned because she thinks that he is just psychotic and that Mulder's operating under false information. Mulder's got in here thinking, I can connect to this guy because I actually believe what he's saying. I believe in these conspiracy theories. I believe in alien abductions. And he does kind of slowly connect to him as he's talking to him in the middle or so of the episode. But Scully's scared because if that's based on inaccurate information, if he's not really that, then Mulder could be easily caught off guard with something he does or whatever. Which actually, I will say, there's a bit of a wonky time thing in this episode. Scully shows up at the hostage situation like halfway or so into the episode. And she even says, I just flew down from Washington to Virginia. Now, I get that in the grand scheme of things, that's not necessarily that long a flight. However, it feels like no time has passed before she shows up from this apparent flight. She calls Krychek, and that's where we get the cliffhanger where she's like, oh no, he's not who Mulder thinks he is. And Krychek's all concerned. And then, 2 scenes later, she shows up saying she's flown down from Washington. And it feels like, maybe an hour later at most. And I suppose you're supposed to read it as this tells you that time has passed, but it doesn't feel like time has passed. It's something it's almost hard to define when movies and TV get this right and when they get it wrong, or why they get it right or wrong sometimes. There's obvious things you can do to show the passage of time. You can do like a montage of time passing, maybe do a shot of a clock that fades to like a later time or something. There's, more on the nose things you can do. But even if you don't use one of those tricks, there is kind of this way of just making it feel like time has passed. And I feel like this episode didn't do that. So when she shows up, it feels like she's walked through a portal. To bring in my DC Comics nerdom here, it feels like she's opened up a boom tube and just teleported from Washington. But anyway, I had to rant about that for a second because it really caught me off guard when she just shows up like like she was in town, like she was just a couple of miles away, but she wasn't. She was in a different state. And even if someone explains to me that, a flight from Washington to Virginia is only like, I don't know how long it is, 2 hours, 90 minutes, I have no idea. But you still have to go to the airport. You still have to like check in. There's still security. Like, and she doesn't even have a ticket plan. She has to just like hope there's a flight that's leaving soon. There's a lot of things that go into this. Anyway, okay, I'm going to shut up about that. I'm going to shut up about it. Okay, we get into the juicy stuff. Which is back to this idea that we're playing with: is he really someone who's abducted or believes he's abducted versus someone who is just having a mental breakdown? And he does do his whole jailbreak at the hospital at the start of the episode. He takes hostages at this travel agency. Not a ton of hostages, but it's like a couple of women, sort of middle-aged man, and then the doctor that he kidnapped from the hospital that he came from. I was almost in two minds about where it was going, because once Scully came in with this revelation that he's actually got real history of mental issues because he took this gunshot to a certain part of his brain that removed his moral center, and like she gives up some precedent, like a prior example of this guy from 100 years ago who had all these delusions and would try to act them out and was genuinely dangerous. And I thought, okay, this is actually interesting if this guy just straight up turns out to be a phony. And not in that he's malicious and that he's a phony, but more just that he's just not really what he's saying he is. And I think that's almost interesting from a consequences perspective to Mulder, because Mulder, as soon as he arrives here, because he's called in and he's like, you want me for a hostage negotiation? That's not what I do. But then they say, oh, the guy believes he's been abducted by aliens. And he's like, maybe I am an expert in this. And they bring him in and they do a whole thing where he's like reading from the script, basically, which is, you have to identify with him, you have to try and feel like you're being honest, they make a point of having him say the names of all the hostages to humanize them for the culprit, for Duane. And they're doing all these things, and he's like, if you just wanted me to read the script, why did you get me to do this? Why not just bring in someone else? If you wanted me here because clearly I have a history with this type of not situation, but this type of person with this experience, that I actually might in some level understand what he's talking about. So it's a little bit frustrating in an intentional way. It's frustrating to like watch him be kind of like handcuffed and what he can actually say and do to Duane. But when Duane gets scared during a power outage and fires a bunch of shots and actually shoots one of the hostages, who's not dead, but he's needing medical attention, Mulder goes in with another FBI agent dressed as paramedics. The other guy actually is a trained paramedic, so he can actually attend to him. But the idea is that Mulder goes in, he's got an earpiece that's like really secret and all that, so he can be given orders as he's talking to Duane. And he quite quickly tries to form a bond by saying he believes him, by saying it happened to his sister. It starts asking him all these questions. I think the thing that makes Duane kind of believe him a little bit and actually start to trust him is that Mulder says, hey, we lost time. When that power went out and the bright light flashed, like, I checked my watch. We lost time. That's what happens, right, when they come. And it's nice that this is not something that's new for this episode. That's something that goes all the way back to episode 1. That was in the pilot of the show, is this idea that the bright light hits and time literally is lost, where you look at the clocks and you've lost 10 minutes or whatever it is. So he sort of builds up this rapport. So to bring in this idea that Scully's comes in saying, look, I've actually looked into this, I think he's just psychotic, and that puts Mulder in danger because Mulder's not in there with who he thinks he is. Mulder's in there with someone who's actually just crazy. I thought that was an interesting development, and I thought it was interesting, like I say, because of consequences, because Mulder always jumps in head first. even when he first arrives here to this hostage situation, as soon as they sort of explain the culprit, they explain who Duane is and that he believes he was abducted by aliens, Mulder starts asking questions about the abductions. Now, don't get me wrong. He's not out of line to do that. I think it's actually smart, because even if you don't believe in what he's saying, it makes sense to understand what his full story is, so you can try and use it or try and understand what he might do based on what he believes, or whatever. There's valid reasons to ask beyond just I instantly believe him and want to take it seriously in that sense. But he kind of like gets slightly confrontational, right? With our big guest star of the episode, actually, CCH Pounder. I was just checking her first initials, because I always forget if it's one C or one or two C's or two H's, but CCH Pounder, who I mainly know from The Shield, but I've seen her pop up in some other things over the years. She's like the agent on site who's like in charge of the hostage thing. But, you know, immediately he gets kind of confrontational with her, and she kind of disregards like this alien crap, and like you're here just to save lives and that's it. And don't get me wrong, I was also frustrated in the other side of things. Well, I'm like, well, you asked Mulder to be here though, so you might as well let him explore this side of it. Otherwise, what's the point of having Mulder here? Mulder, like I said, kind of makes that point himself when he's complaining about just reading from the script later on. But he does just kind of quickly want to jump in and believe. He just immediately thinks it's all real. Whereas it felt like the smarter play would be to still be skeptical and still say, look, I do believe in alien abductions, but obviously a lot of them aren't real. I want to try and establish. See, if he had just said this to them, it might have actually landed with them. If he said to the other agents, look, I do believe in alien abductions, I know you don't, but obviously there's a lot of fake ones. I want to establish if this guy lines up with what is real or what is not. And of course, Mulder, pretty much it never feels like he ever does entertain the idea that it's not real. He just seems to think it is very, very quickly. And I thought the idea of like there being serious consequences where he's put in danger because he did just believe this guy with little evidence or proof. Admittedly, the power going out and the big flash of light did, you know, it is something, right? That is something to at least line up with Mulder's previous experiences. And it's the one thing looking back, because I was almost a little disappointed when they started like turning it back again. You know, after the hostage situation ends and Mulder does eventually get scared because he's told to try and lure him over to the door so the snipers can take him out. And he actually saves him at one point without Duane realizing. He says, hey, Duane, come here. And it takes him away from like the sort of the kill spot. And it's because he wants to talk to him about what's, you know, his past. He wants to ask him questions about the abductions. But then, you know, Scully's there. She talks into the earpiece so he can hear her, and she tells him all this stuff. So it gets to the point where Mulder actually gets scared because he kind of pisses him off, and then says, hey, you forgot to lock the door after you let the two hostages out, because he let the two women out by this point. Mulder appealed to his better nature. And Mulder does actually seemingly get a bit scared and makes the choice. And I did like that moment. I liked that moment where he'd already actively kind of like interfered with what the FBI operation was by luring him away from the kill spot. But then he got scared and had to lure him back towards it and sort of gave him a reason to go back to over to the door. That felt, again, what I was just saying about consequences, that felt like he realized the situation he's in. He's realized that, oh shit, I've put myself here, I've believed this guy, and that actually might have been a huge, huge mistake. So him having to go back on that and send them back over to the door felt like it really tied into that for me. And I didn't know how to feel initially after the fact when they start like examining his body and stuff. And he's alive, for the record. He's still alive, which is important for the cliffhanger. But he's in the hospital. And CCH Pounder like tells Mulder, hey, thanks for the help, but I thought you should probably know there is actually some weird things about this. Well, we checked them over, and the 3 locations in his body he said that the aliens planted trackers in actually do have like pieces of metal. Also, he said they drilled holes in his teeth, and the dentist checked, they are there, and there's no instruments that a dentist has on Earth that could do this without breaking the tooth. Like, it's actually, you know, she's basically like, hey, this is kind of otherworldly. There might be some truth to what he was saying. And when this first came up, I was kind of thinking, oh, I'm a little disappointed almost that we're taking this away. I almost think there was more power in this turning out to not be a real thing and it to just be a a troubled person who has mental problems. I actually think one or two episodes occasionally, just having that kind of ending where it wasn't real, and kind of tell us a more poignant story about it, and maybe teach Mulder a few lessons about just believing everything he hears, I think would be quite powerful. Of course, at this point, I didn't know it was a two-parter. So I thought we were just doing the sort of the quick pivot at the end to, no, there's some truth to it, some creepy stuff happened. And of course, the big flash of light earlier I'd kind of forgotten about that almost when I was thinking about everything else here. But yeah, like, there were reasons to think that maybe there was truth to it as well. Like, he can be also crazy on top of being really abducted by aliens. Like, that's very much a possible thing. But yeah, he takes the metal to Scully. Scully, who, despite not being around for the first half of the episode that much, actually has quite a lot in the second half. And I was really noticing this episode, by the way, that they were avoiding showing her, her stomach. Like, they were really, like, I especially noticed it at the supermarket, because it's one thing when there's just always a shot from, like, the chest up, but it was really noticeable at the supermarket because she's sort of, like, hiding behind the checkout, and I just thought, oh, okay. It's actually almost taken me out of it a little bit because I know, and I'm just noticing all the little tricks they're doing to avoid showing that she's pregnant. But basically, Scully has this metal analyzed by a ballistics expert. He's like, it could be a bit of shrapnel. He was in Vietnam or whatever. Could be this, could be that. But when they look at it under like a microscope, and there's like a tiny little like sort of engraving, and I actually thought immediately, that's a barcode. That's the first thing I thought of. It's not until Scully's at the supermarket, though, where she's getting her stuff beeped through the machine, and she's sort of like, And when the woman gets up and goes to do something for her job, Scully takes the bit of metal out and puts it under the barcode scanner, and it sends the whole machine into a bit of a tizzy where there's a bunch of weird digits like flashing, and it's sort of confused, like she's overloaded the system. And it freaks her out, but it does sort of like suggest that this indeed is a barcode. Now, I'm not entirely sure. I just want to put out here that I'm not convinced that a barcode scanner would be able to read a barcode that's that small. What I thought she was going to do was put a photograph of the barcode, the same thing she was looking at on the screen in the prior scene. I thought she was going to take a photograph that had been enlarged and put that under the barcode scanner. So I was surprised when she pulled out the actual tiny bit of metal and put it in, because as the guy pointed out in the previous scene when he was doing the ballistics, he said this was only like, I can't even remember what the measurement was. I've never used it because it's so small, but it was like only 10 like fractions of a centimeter or something across. It's like tiny. And I'm like, I'm not convinced that a barcode scanner would actually be able to pick it up if it was that small. I don't know, because they're not designed to read something that's that small. I get there's some flexibility, but it felt a little far-fetched. That said, though, it made for a cool moment. She looked freaked out. Like I say, though, I was still a little bit disappointed that it's turning out that Mulder was just right to believe, when I feel like he could use a loss here. And it's almost a shame that it's now more about convincing Scully that there was truth to this. But at the end of the episode, she's on the phone at her home, phoning Mulder to tell him about this barcode thing. And she believes that it's been used to catalogue him. That's what it seems like, at least, that it's like a cataloguing system, presumably all the people they've abducted. And the cliffhanger is that he's at her window. And I was thinking this. I wasn't thinking that he would show up at her place, because we see him escape the hospital briefly, like amongst in these scenes. But I was thinking that if these are trackers, it would maybe make sense if the aliens would now come to Scully because she has the tracker. I was thinking they were going to do something with that. Instead, it's Duane himself that shows up at the end at the window, and we hear a little bit of commotion over Mulder's answering machine as it goes to the to be continued. So it's a fun ending, and I am interested. I think this is an interesting setup for the next episode. I think Scully being abducted by this guy, Mulder having more of a motivation to get to him, but also this new knowledge that there's probably some truth to what he's been saying, is quite interesting. But I do also think it would have been fascinating if it had just turned out to be delusions, especially since it felt like at times it was playing in so perfectly into everything else we know. Because at one point he talks about how the government are in on it, and we see like these visualizations of what happened to him, and he's like lying in the bed and the bright lights flashing. Also, by the way, epilepsy warning for those of you who suffer from flashing lights. This episode during these abduction scenes are totally like trigger warning levels. Okay, like I'm fine with it, but it caught me off guard. It was really hitting me hard. But we see like literally two guys in like suits standing off to the side as if they're literally there when he's been abducted, and I'm sure that's just a representation in his head here as opposed to being literal. But it was an interesting visual, and it plays into like why Mulder would sort of buy into the lie a little bit, and I appreciate that. This is probably the episode that gets the most fire in the sky. I kind of glossed over these things in the middle, but there are these flashes to like seeing him be abducted when he's talking to Mulder, and there's one where you see him on what is seemingly an alien ship. You don't, it's just darkness around him, but the table's kind of, fancy, and there's this alien standing over the top of him. You see aliens quite explicitly in this episode, and they're doing experiments, and they've got him pinned down. They've got look, it's very biblical. It's like he's got nails through his like wrists and his feet. He even looks like is it Da Vinci who did that famous classical drawing of the man with a circle around him? I can't remember what it's called. People will know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. But it very much looked like that. The visual of that was not lost on me. I recognized it immediately with him lying on this circular table with the circles within it. It felt very intentionally kind of playing on that. But yeah, I mean, those scenes were visually interesting for sure. It wasn't as good as Fire in the Sky, certainly, because that's one of the best alien abduction scenes of all time, but it was definitely kind of tickling into that territory for sure. It's maybe the most explicit it's been thus far with this kind of thing. So as far as anything else goes, what did we have? I mean, Krychek's not a big part of this episode. He's kind of just there to tell Mulder there's something going on, and then he answers the phone later. There is a joke at one point where CCH Pounder tries to get him to go get a coffee when he asks if there's anything he can do to help. So it's just a little joke at his expense, and that's pretty much it. That's all the Krychek stuff this episode. I mean, as a piece of television, it was a very entertaining episode. Hostage stories are always easy entertainment, I feel. You have a very simple premise, you have a simple setup, you've got the crisis room where the actual thing's happening, and then you've got the team that are trying to figure out and problem solve, and that makes for compelling stories to me, typically. Because you've got a lot of second guessing, you've got like a lot of cooks in the kitchen, in a good way, where you're seeing how all the different ideas of how to tackle it are clashing. And here you have this extra element of like Mulder, I think that's the when I talk about consequences for Mulder's like fixation to the point, like even though he does like successfully get him to let some of the hostages go, he does make that deal, right? He does that, but it's prompted after Scully tells him to. She's like, hey, you've got his trust, try and use that kind of thing. Or maybe it's CCH Pounder is back on the mic at that point, I can't remember. But that kind of prompts him to sort of like, hey, we're buddies now, right? Let the girls go. You've got me, you've got your doctor. They're kind of irrelevant at this point. Like, you just let them go. And he does do that. But it definitely felt like for large stretches while he's in there with the hostage taker, while he's in there with Duane and he's tied up, it felt like he was far more interested in talking about his alien abduction past than he ever was about saving anyone's lives. And I'm not saying Mulder doesn't care by any means. I'm just saying it feels like he's got a priority list. And the number one priority seems to be to find out more about this alien shit. Everything else is second. And I think, again, there being some consequences to that, with Mulder actually being scared of what he might do later in the episode, I think still works for me, even though it turns out there is truth to what he's saying, potentially. I do want to really just reiterate that as much as I'm saying I was a little disappointed in the direction it took in the last 10 minutes, kind of, because I thought it was almost more interesting to just have it not be real. I still want to make it clear it was a very entertaining episode of TV, and it still left me in an intriguing spot for the next part. Like, I think part 2 might obviously make this all click even better, because we'll see how the story wraps up with Duane and we'll see where it goes. But for right now, this was a very compelling episode of TV that had tension. It had good direction. The opening scene in 1985 where the camera's just kind of going around this sort of like half-finished house and following the dog, and it's nighttime. That was spooky. It was good stuff. All the stuff with Duane was pretty good. The only maybe minor exception to that is that when he first wakes up in that opening scene, he says something to the effect of, no, it can't be, or something like that. And that line reading did feel kind of cheesy to me. I almost think it would have been better if he didn't say anything. It just felt a little bit on the cheesy side. But by and large, this episode was tense. It was entertaining. It put the characters in difficult situations. There's just, I just have a few nitpicks here or there, and I almost felt so interested in the idea that he wasn't really an abductee, and that Mulder would have to deal with that after the fact, to be so compelling that when they sort of pivoted to it's actually just real, it just kind of felt a bit more like a normal episode again. Not a bad episode, but a bit more normal. But I'm looking forward to seeing what it does in part 2 and how it wraps up. It does sound like a fun premise, having Scully be kidnapped by him. Because, we spent a lot of episode time this episode with him talking to Mulder, so it's quite interesting. The next episode potentially will be the opposite of that, where he's talking to Scully for a lot of the episode. He already got the one who's sympathetic to his viewpoint. Now he gets the skeptic, although admittedly a skeptic who has just been given some really compelling hard evidence that maybe there's some truth to this. So I think that's interesting. One more point, actually, just on the whole Mulder priority list and seeming to care more about the alien abduction stuff than the hostages. When I said that, Scully kind of like has to come in and tell him all this stuff and maybe remind him that he's there to save hostages and she's there to protect them, I do think that feeds into a lot of what the show has been so far, which is that Scully balances him out and is kind of actively his like conscience, not his conscience, that's not quite right, because Mulder's not a bad person, but she's there to kind of like look after him and keep him right, and sort of when he does go into the deep end a little bit, she's there to pull him back out and keep his priorities more in check, kind of thing. And I think that was another example of that in this episode. But anyway, that's my thoughts on the Duane Barry episode of X-Files. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments. Like, subscribe, all the usual stuff. Helps out a bunch if you do. And of course, you can support everything over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and help keep all the content coming. But thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you next time. I normally read the next time on X-Files, but I won't do that for this one because it's a two-parter. So, because we've already got the setup. We know where we're going. So I'll leave it there. I don't want to spoil anything. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?